We are going to be studying today the 10 teachings that are of great significance for the first page of Brachot, the beginning of the Talmud. Brachot Beis Amud Aleph. Sorry about the lighting there. The mishna begins with Me'ei Masai Koran es Hashma Ba'arvin. When do we begin to recite the Shema in the evening? Let's begin by talking about what is the oral law, what is the Rabbinic law. I once heard Moshe Idel, I believe he was quoting somebody else, but this is going back 20 years, so I don't remember who he was quoting. But at that time, he gave a great summation where he said the written Torah is the book of what? The oral Torah, the Talmud, is the book of how, and the Kabbalah is the book of why. So, in a sense, the Mishnah appropriately begins with Me'ei Masai, from when, as the book of how do we do what the Torah tells us. The Torah tells us recite the text of the Torah or some part of the Torah in the evening and the morning. Comes the Talmud and says, how do we do that? Or better yet, in this particular instance, when do we do that? Because the Talmud and the halacha is really very much focused on how we do what the Bible says to do. Okay, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's a very good 1-minute overview of what rabbinic oral law is, what the Talmud is. Number 2 of the top 10 teachings of the first page of the Talmud is how does a rabbi talk to his children, especially when the rabbi disagrees with his contemporaries and he's a minority opinion. The story is told, the first Mishnah begins by telling us that there was a debate about until when you could recite the evening Shema. And the first opinion, they all agree that it should start in the evening. What the evening is will be discussed on the next page. But until when, they disagree. Rabbi Eliezer, who's the rabbi that we're going to talk about in terms of his conversation with his children, said you could say the evening Shema until dawn. The sages, meaning the majority opinion, they say you have to say the evening Shema till midnight. Again, halachic midnight may not be exactly our midnight, but it's approximately often pretty close to it. Just keep into account daylight savings time would definitely alter midnight. Rabbi Gamliel actually really has another opinion, and he says, no, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Rabbi Eliezer is the first opinion, says you have to only the first third of the night. And the sages say you have till midnight, and Rabbi Gamliel was the one I wanted to talk about. He says you have till dawn. My eyes are not so great, and the Talmud I'm using is kind of, on the small side, so I can hold it and be comfortable with it. So I got to check my eyes. Anyway, so the story is as follows. Rabbi Gamliel's kids were at a wedding party, and they came back in the middle of the night, and it was obviously past midnight, and they said, well, we didn't read the Shema. And it was kind of an awkward question because they knew his opinion, presumably they knew his opinion, was that you have all night, you have till dawn. So why were they even asking him? Why didn't they just read the Shema? Because they must have also known that his contemporaries, the rabbis, disagreed with Rabbi Gamliel, and they believed you only had till midnight, and they were kind of in this awkward position where they were asking the father, what do? We know you think we should say the Shema. We don't necessarily agree with you because the halacha generally follows the majority. The principle is that we go after the majority. There are a number of exceptions to that, and we will address many of those exceptions if we do continue to study together. But Rabbi Gamliel gave them the following answer. He says, you're obligated to read it, not just because I say so, But even the rabbis who say that you have to read it till by midnight, they only say that as a rabbinic decree. They agree with me in principle, biblically speaking, that you have all night. They just want to create a fence so that somebody by accident shouldn't fall asleep and then forget to say the Shema, and then it will be too late. So we see from here this very important concept of one rabbi, instead of just saying the other rabbis are wrong, he acknowledges that perhaps they're right. However, he just qualifies the limits of what they're saying. They're not saying that you are no longer have to say the Shema. They just said you should say it before midnight so that you don't come to make a mistake. So that's the second teaching about how to talk to your children about respect, which is key here because there's so many disagreements. So what's really important is that although rabbis disagree, it's important for them to be able to articulate those disagreements with a way of respecting their opponents. The third teaching is that very concept of the rabbis instituting something that's not biblically mandated. The idea of what the rabbis do is they are the protectors of the law, and they often find that the only way to kind of protect the law is to create a safeguard. And that concept we're going to see again and again. I don't really need to dwell on it here per se, but this concept of making a safeguard, and the question will become, what is the difference between the actual Torah itself, the biblical Torah, and the rabbinic safeguards? And there are a number of differences, and they will be discussed further in the Talmud, of course. Number three. Number four is we're going to analyze a little bit the difference between Rashi and Tosafot. Right away, Rashi points out here that here you can give a look at it. It's highlighted in the yellow, right? So Rashi points out that what we're talking about here is the Shema that we say before we go to bed. Because religious Jews will actually say Shema twice every evening. One time they'll say it in what's called the Meir of the evening service, and the second time they'll say it is an abbreviated form, just the first paragraph of the Shema before they go to bed, colloquially known as Kriya Shema Shel Hamita, the Shema of the bed. So Rashi says that bedtime Shema, that's the main biblical Shema, because that's said really in the evening. And the only reason why we say the Shema in the service is because it would be inappropriate, Rashi says, and he quotes a Yerushalmi, a Jerusalem Talmud, to stand up to pray without having words of Torah, to connect, again, the idea of the biblical Torah to prayer, which is, at least the words of prayer, are rabbinic in origin. And Tosafot disagrees with him, and he has a number of blistering attacks on that comment in Rashi. I'll just list them very quickly. One is, if the main Shema was the one you said at night, we would have had to say all three chapters of it, which we don't. We only say one. Two, if that was the main Shema, we would have to say the blessings that precede and come after it. And three, the Talmud itself says on a few pages later that it's to protect somebody from mazikin, which is kind of like either demonic forces, harmful energy. And this is a scholar doesn't have to say that additional bedtime Shema because he or she is safe because of the Torah they study. And number four, we established the law like Rabbi Yochanan, and that would seem to indicate that you'd have to say the Shemona Esrei after the Shema. And number five, that's it for those are four the questions. Many people talk about what we say in Yiddish, ve'enfer Rashi, which means to respond and answer the questions that Tosafos asks. We don't have real time to get into who Rashi and Tosafos are, but I'll just say very quickly, Rashi was born in 1040 and passed away in 1105 in Troyes, in the Champagne region of what is now France. And he had his three daughters, all married rabbis. His grandchildren were great scholars. At least four of them were part of the Balei HaTosafot, they're called. The Tosafot literally just means like the additions, the glosses. The Rashi will be found on the inner side of each page of Talmud, and Tosafos will be found on the outer side of each page of Talmud. Although the most famous Tosafot is Rabbeinu Tam, is one of the grandsons of Rashi, there were many Balei Tosafot, and one of their main preoccupations was arguing with Rashi. That period of the Balei Tosafot lasted for a few hundred years, and they have amazing history. So, for example, there was a time when they burnt 10,000 manuscripts, Talmudic manuscripts. And the goal of, I think it was one of the popes that ordered the burning or was involved in instigating that burning, was that there would be no more Talmud, and without the Talmud, Judaism would cease to exist. The Balei Tosafot, and this was about 12 something. This is 800 years ago approximately. The masters of the Tosafot took it upon themselves to each study at least one tractate by heart, so they could be the keepers of this tradition and teach it. And they were instrumental in keeping the Talmud alive for hundreds of years. And still in their work, the Talmud is very much alive, and their influence on Jewish law is quite immense. Okay, so those two characters, Rashi and Tosafos, even though Tosafos is more than one character, like I said, many rabbis spanning hundreds of years, we just colloquially call them all, roll them into one ball called Tosafot. And there are like kind of these running arguments throughout the Talmud, and that's one of the things that keeps the Talmud interesting, is not just its own arguments within its own text, but the arguments amongst the commentaries as well, and their own fascinating stories. Number 5, is this whole very concept that the Mishnah is talking about, which is time. It begins by talking about the evening. What is the time of the evening prayer? So, Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, one of my favorite Hasidic Rebbes, a disciple of the Mea Shiloh, the Ishbitzer Rebbe, who lived in 18th century Poland, talks about this Mishnah and this section of the Talmud and explains the following. He says, we have, time represents the very essence of change, but within every minute and every hour is a new moment. But the sun setting and the stars coming up, and those are going to be concepts in halacha that we're going to describe, and as the Talmud progresses to kind of try to define what is evening and what is day, and this in between time. But beyond the halachic qualifications of identifying evening, which is what we're going to be doing, is also the heart of it, which is it's a new time. Evening represents a change in the world, as does morning. And each of those times asks us to kind of reorganize ourselves in our gratitude and in our relationship to that which is held in most high estimation, to ultimately to our divine source and our purpose in being. And that's why this kind of identification of time that we're preoccupied in our Mishnah, both the beginning of the time of Shema that the Talmud will describe and the end of the time of the Shema of the evening that the Mishnah itself describes, are critical to understanding when and how we serve God. In fact, we say, Lahagid baboker chastecha ve'emunatcha baleilot. In order to recount your kindness in the morning and your faithfulness in the evening. That means that each of these time periods, in terms of their prayer and the recitation of the Shema, they both talk to us about periods in history, whether it's world history, Jewish history, or even a person's own biographical kind of time periods of what their life is. The morning represents light and represents when things are going well, and then you need to be grateful for the kindness that God has given you. The evening represents the struggle, but even in the hardship of night, there's the seeds of salvation are yet growing in that darkness, and the stars are shining, and our future, which may look dim, is in fact very bright if we just have the fortitude to have faith and hold on to at that time. So in that sense, when we talk about time, we talk about the evening and the morning, we're talking about the passage of not just physical time, but our emotional and spiritual relationship to it. And that's very key here to what the Mishnah in Brachot is talking about. Number 6, we're talking about the origin of the Mishnah. In this case, I'm not going to talk about the origin of the Mishnah in general, but the origin of this Mishnah. The Gemara says, Tana hechakai, diktanim emasai. Where exactly is the author of this Mishnah jumping off from? In other words, he makes a statement, from when do you read the Shema in the evening? The question is, where is he? What's the prequel to that statement? And the Gemara will answer, Tana Akrakai. The author of the Mishnah is basing his statement and question on a biblical verse. The verse says, you should recite these words when you bishachvacha uvkamecha, when you lie down, meaning when you go to bed in the evening, and uvkamecha, when you get up in the morning. In other words, to put it more bluntly, the Mishnah, where's the Mishnah from? The Mishnah begins with a biblical text, begins with a biblical concept or law or word or verse. And based on that law and based on that word and based on that verse, the Mishnah and then the Gemara say, well, how do we implement this? And this is, again, like I said before, the Talmud is how. The Bible says what it is we do, and the Talmud says how it is that we do it. And in this case, when is part of the how. Okay, so that was number 6. Number 7 is a very powerful thing I'm going to study. I'm going to teach a little bit of Zohar. A lot of people are very much purists. They believe that you study Talmud, and you probably shouldn't study the Kabbalah or the Zohar at all for whatever the reason is, not for now. But if you do, you keep them separate. That's not really what I believe. I believe that I don't make a big cholent out of them. I don't just mash them indiscriminately, but I try to think deeply about when one informs the other, because they are in a relationship with one another. And the Talmud, although I called it the book of how, quoting somebody else, I don't even know who that originally came up with that, but despite being the book of how, and the Kabbalah being the book of why, or books, they're all thousands of books collectively with their commentaries and so on. The Talmud also is concerned with why, and the Zohar is also concerned with how, although they're primarily concerned with their respective focuses, which is in the Talmud of how, and the Kabbalah the why. So I do like to cross over a little bit, and I'm going to do that right here. The Gemara says, you want to know what we're dealing with here? We're dealing with, why do we start in the evening and not in the morning with this discussion of reciting the Shema? Because we're going to get to reciting the Shema in the morning later. It's because there's 2 reasons. One is the verse itself says when you go to sleep and when you get up. Another reason is it's like the creation of the world. Right? It says in the Genesis story, it says V'hi erev v'hi boker yom rishon. It was evening, or yom echad. It was evening and it was morning one day, and that's how we recount the all the days of creation. It says it was evening, it was morning. So we see first darkness, then light. First evening, and then day. So what does the Zohar say about this? The Zohar talks about in the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha, when it talks about Abraham leaving his place that he grew up in. It lets us know, the Zohar lets us know that there's this important concept that the framework for every answer has to be a question. The framework for every journey has to be something that's lacking in you, that calls out for you to begin a trip, that you're going to find something. You're going to find, in this sense of Abraham, he had to be missing something for God to call out to him and say, Abraham, go from where you are. In that sense, the Jewish people as a whole, Bnei Yisrael, in order for us to receive the Torah, in order for us to get to Shavuot, we needed to start with Pesach. We needed to start with Egypt and slavery and darkness and get out from there. If you want to know an answer, you first have to have a question. If you want to know light, you have to be familiar with darkness to distinguish between the light and the darkness. And that's where gratitude comes from. A lot of people, when they have everything, when they have their health, when they have things are well, they don't even really understand the concept of gratitude. So that's, again, a psychological meaning of a biblical verse, or verses in this case, that the Talmud quotes in the first page of the Talmud, which is we begin with the evening, and then we proceed to the day. We begin with the question, and only then do we get to the answer. So that was number 7. And now number 8. Number 8 is the mitzvah of reciting the Shema. Most authorities hold that the mitzvah of reciting the Shema is a biblical mitzvah, and it has to be recited in the evening and in the morning. The question is that one mitzvah for both, or is it a mitzvah separately? One mitzvah for the evening and one mitzvah for the morning. And that's a debate between Maimonides, who says it's one mitzvah to have the Shema recited in the evening and in the morning, and other Rishonim that argue on him, other medieval rabbinic scholars like Nachmanides, who says, why are you counting them as one mitzvah? Each one is its own mitzvah. One way to understand it is Maimonides is kind of gauging that it's, even though we do it twice a day, they're so similar in nature, or the two counterpoints to one declaration, that we could count it as one mitzvah. There are many interpretations to kind of answer Maimonides' way of numbering this particular mitzvah. We don't have time for that now. A lot of these things will be elaborated further. Number 9 is the Gemara mentions that we're going to be talking about soon the blessings that come before and after the recitation of the evening Shema and the morning Shema. So the question is, we start off with this biblical injunction to recite the Shema every evening, and then we're going to get to every morning, and then the rabbis start talking about the blessings that they instituted that we recite on the Shema. And the question is, why? And the answer is that the very nature of the Talmud and our tradition is that we take something, a biblical law, in this case the recitation of the Shema, and we bracket it, surround it with, in this case, blessings that the rabbis instituted. Now, later on in this tractate, we're going to introduce a lot of blessings. So many blessings that have very little to do with biblical requirements. They're just simply rabbinic requirements. But before we do that, the Talmud wants to make a link between biblical and rabbinic law. Not every rabbinic law can have an exact link to biblical law, but it always has a link to another rabbinic law that will be linked to a biblical law, with very few exceptions. And therefore, it's very important for the Talmud to kind of anchor the whole tractate in a biblical requirement to recite the Shema every evening and every morning, then extend that into blessings for the Shema, and then to further extend that into blessings in general. And that's a very important part of understanding the rabbinic literature in general, and the Talmud in particular, and Brachot individually as well. That was number 9, and the 10th and final one is a little bit of Jewish trivia. What is the first mitzvah that's a bar mitzvah of somebody who becomes 13, bar mitzvah boy would do as a bar mitzvah? Somebody's required to do mitzvot. Everybody's thinking, probably you're going to say putting on tefillin or making a bracha on dinner. But the answer would actually be reciting the evening Shema, because the day begins in the evening, and the first biblical mitzvah that comes every evening is reciting the Shema in the evening. Thank you for watching. That is the some of the top teachings on Brachot Beis Amud Aleph.